Good day. Today's video, like all my recent videos extending all the way back to February, is going to be about the Ukraine crisis, something which, as I've said, I think is inevitable given the centrality of this crisis in global affairs at the present time. Now, I'm going to first deal with two, I think, very minor topics, or at least one is definitely very minor. The other one may not be, it might be quite important, but I'm going to deal with them quickly at the start of this video and dispose of them. The first one can dispose of very fast, and that was reports which appeared over the media, over the Western media, over the last few days about an exchange of messages between Vladimir Putin of Russia, the president of Russia, and Kim Jong-Un, the leader of North Korea. Now, these messages were interpreted by various people in the Western media as an indication that Russia and North Korea intend to strengthen their relations. And there were quotations from Putin's message which appeared to suggest that, and there were also quotations from Kim Jong-un's message which appeared to suggest that Russia and North Korea were moving towards some sort of anti-American alliance. Well, I found this difficult to understand because when I went to the Kremlin website, there was no mention there, no mention at all of any exchange of messages between President Putin and Kim Jong-un. And when I checked the Russian news agency TASS, Russia's official news agency, there was no mention of any exchange of messages there either. Well, I did eventually find these messages. They appeared in the North Korean media, and having read them, I can say that they are completely routine. They are messages which probably were written by the officials in the respective foreign ministries. Putin and Kim will have just glanced at them and affixed their signature, probably, but they are of no importance whatsoever, and they do not merit the coverage that they've received in the Western media. Briefly, August happens to be the anniversary of the march of the Red Army into Korea in August 1945, when the Soviet Union carried out a massive whirlwind campaign against the Japanese army, which was at that time occupying large areas of northern China and Korea as well. And it is entirely understandable that the Russian and North Korean leaders should exchange greetings and congratulations and commemorate that event, which ultimately played a key role in the eventual formation of the Democratic Republic, People's Republic of Korea, in other words, North Korea, the North Korean state. And that is all that happened. I'm sure that the same, very similar messages get exchanged between the Russian and North Korean leaders every year. So nothing should be, no weight should be put on this story. Somebody noticed that North Korea was publishing these telegrams. North Korea publishes pretty much everything, every foreign message that Kim Jong-un receives and which he responds to, however routine it may appear to be. And somebody noticed this in the West and tried to make a story about it, about some kind of emerging alliance between what I think some people in the media want to represent as two rogue states, Russia and, of course, North Korea. But, as I said, I don't think there's any substance to this story at all. Now, the second story is actually much more interesting, and it is entirely based on the reporting of a Lebanese-based journalist, Elijah Manier, who I should say is a giant of Middle East reporting. I mean, he is somebody who, when he reports a story, one takes it extremely seriously. Now, about a couple of weeks ago, I think it was Jake Sullivan in the United States, floated a story that the Russians were about to buy drones from Iran, and this attracted a lot of attention, and I made my skepticism about that story very, very clear. It seemed to me unlikely that Russia was actually going to buy drones from Iran. Well, Elijah Marnier now says that this is true, that Russia is indeed going to buy drones from Iran, and Marnier claims that he's had this information from Iranian sources, and he says that 1,000 Iranian drones are going to be supplied to Russia. Now, I'm going to just say this about this. Marnier is someone, as I said, whom one takes extremely seriously. But he is not the Russian or Iranian governments, which up to now have been denying the truth of this story. And 1,000 drones does seem to me to be an awful lot of drones. And I wonder how quickly these could be produced and sold by Iran to Russia. And I have to say that suggestions that the Russians would be looking for co-production with Iran of these drones on Russian territory seems to me, again, a strange story, given, as I said previously, that Russia is now producing essentially very similar drones itself. So I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait and see whether we have corroboration of this story from an official source, from the Russian and Iranian governments. I have huge respect for Elijah Marnier, but every reporter is only as good as and as reliable as his sources, and sometimes it's been known to happen that stories are provided by sources that can appear to be extremely reliable, but which turn out to be untrue. There's been many instances when this has happened, and even the best journalists, of which Elijah Marnier unequivocally is one, do sometimes get caught out. So I'm not saying this story is false. I'm not saying it's untrue. All I am saying is that I want to see some corroboration from the governments in Moscow and Tehran before I take it, I accept it as true and start discussing and analysing it further. Anyway, without more ado, let's turn once more to events in Ukraine. And the first thing to say is that this morning there's been more reports of an explosion at an ammunition depot in Crimea, and this time the Russian Ministry of Defense has said unequivocally that the explosion was the result of sabotage. So I think we can now say with conclusively that there is clearly some kind of underground cell or sabotage group which is pro-Ukrainian or Ukrainian, which is operating in Crimea and which has been tasked to carry out attacks against Russian military infrastructure in Crimea itself. And I think we can also say, definitely, that there have been significant lapses in security at Russian ammunition depots and bases. Now, as I've discussed previously, when I discussed the fire at the airbase in Saki a short time ago, if it was sabotage, then that would be a very serious concern for the Russian government, for the Russian authorities. It would show that there's been a major breakdown in security in Crimea. And now that it apparently is confirmed to be sabotage, the Russian authorities are going to take this extremely seriously. And there's going to be a major hunt for the people responsible in Crimea. And given that the Russians have a long history of extremely efficient and effective counterinsurgency forces, after all, they perfected this type of work in Syria and even more so in their long struggle in the Northern Caucasus. I suspect that this cell or sabotage group, or it might be more than one, will eventually be tracked down and destroyed. Now, I don't know how long that's going to take. It may take a long time, but anyway, this is something that is going to concern the Russians a great deal. In military terms, however, this is a pinprick, and I think the same was true of the fire in Saki, at the airfield in Saki. The Russian authorities, the British authorities, even the British Ministry of Defence, admitted that the Russians would be able to replace the aircraft that were destroyed in Saki very quickly. And the ammunition depot fire, and by the way, the previous attack on the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet, all of these things are pinpricks. They're not going to make any fundamental difference to the military operation in Ukraine. Now, the Russian military operation in Ukraine. Now, having said that, this story is not to be downrated. As I said, it is both a huge embarrassment for the Russians and a very serious matter for the Russians, because, as I said, it confirms that that security within Crimea is not secure, and some kind of underground cell or sabotage group is operating in Crimea. And that will be a serious matter for the Russians, and it will require a commitment of resources and a diversion of energy that perhaps the Russians might not have wished for. Now, a couple of days ago, there was a meeting in Moscow of Russia's Security Council, and there was a discussion, clearly. Russia's Security Council is Russia's top decision-making body, but it deals principally with military and security issues, though it does also deal with political and economic and foreign policy ones. But as I said, ultimately, its ultimate purpose is to deal with state security and defense issues. And it was chaired by Putin himself, as all these meetings invariably are. Now, there was some speculation when this meeting took place that the topic of discussion was the shelling of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. I was skeptical about this. I didn't think it would be about the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, because there was one thing about this meeting that was extremely interesting, which was that other than provide a list of the people who attended this meeting, which included, by the way, all the top security and intelligence people in the Russian government, there was actually no readout, no indication at all of what was discussed. It was described as a routine meeting, but these meetings are never routine. And when they are simply routine meetings, and the vast majority of cases when these meetings of the Security Council do occur, the Kremlin does at least provide some indication of the topics of discussion, sometimes even limited transcripts and excerpts of some of the things that are said, though obviously we never get the full, complete picture of what was discussed at these meetings. Well, as I said, this one was unusual in that it provided no such information at all. It was absolute silence about what was the topic of discussion at this meeting. Now, had it been a discussion about the attacks on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, I think the Kremlin would have said as much. I don't see why the Russians would not want to make it publicly known that the Russia Security Council had discussed that topic. I think that they would have, on the contrary, wanted to publicize the fact that they were discussing it, and they would undoubtedly have used the Security Council meeting and its discussion of the attacks on the nuclear power plant, to advance Russia's case that it is Ukraine that is shelling this nuclear power plant and is creating all the risks of a nuclear accident consequent upon this shelling. So I don't see why the Russian authorities would keep the information about what was discussed at this meeting secret if the topic was the attacks on the nuclear power plant. I am going to suggest that the topic is the sabotage attacks in Crimea. And clearly there is an issue for the Russians, very serious issue for the Russians about what's going on in Crimea. Probably some very top people are going to be sent to Crimea to carry out an on-the-spot inspection of what's going on. And as I said, over the next few days, we're going to see a major Russian security operation and security sweep being conducted in Crimea. And it is entirely plausible that the Security Council, the Kremlin in other words, would have had a discussion about this whole topic and would want to keep that discussion secret. Now, I think one further point I'm going to make, which is that the more attacks this cell or sabotage group, or perhaps there's more than one, carry out in Crimea, the more information the Russian security forces will gather about them. They already know that these people, whoever they are able to get access to Russian base facilities, including very secure base facilities and ammunition depots, and that they're very well informed about those depots. And obviously that could be based to some extent on satellite and intelligence data provided by Western special services, and the Russians always bring up the British here. That's, by the way, been a pattern of Russian commentary ever since the Second World War, the early Cold War periods. The Russians have always tended to blame the British for this sort of thing. I wouldn't place too much reliance on that. But anyway, putting that aside, the very fact that these this cell, this sabotage group, has been able to penetrate Russian-based facilities shows that they must have some help from the inside, and that the fact that they've been able to do it in various base facilities suggests that this help that they're getting from the inside is probably at a reasonably high level within the security apparatus in Crimea. That's just my guess. So already the Russians will have constructed a picture about how these people, how this cell operates, and they will be able to work on that in order eventually to track them down. And track them down they will. And I think that is something one should say. Security in Crimea was probably already been tightened. There'll be steps taken to ensure that these people, whoever they are, aren't able to leave Crimea. And I think that probably at some point in the next days or weeks, we will learn, or perhaps we won't learn. Perhaps the Russians will decide to keep the matter to themselves. But one way or another, this particular group will be eliminated. So this is an important development. It's one, as I said, that's been embarrassing for the Russian authorities. It's one which I believe has been discussed at the highest level by this Security Council meeting. And I think we're going to see a scramble over the next few hours and days to deal with the problem in Crimea and to sort it out. So that's what I wanted to say about this. On the battlefields, however, all these pinprick attacks in Crimea and elsewhere. There was another attack, by the way, on the headquarters of the Wagner Group in Popasnaya, which I suspect was based on a security lapse by a journalist. I'm not going to go into that in any detail. But all of these pinprick attacks are having no impact on developments on the battlefields. It's quite clear that the Russians are continuing their advance. And what we are hearing now is of further Russian advances towards Ugledar. This is this town in southern Donetsk region, which is important in terms of the supply lines for the Ukrainian forces opposite Donetsk city, which are also already coming under immense pressure following the fall of Pesky, this important fortified village, which is a linchpin of the fortifications, the Ukrainian fortifications there. And we're getting more news, by the way, that the Russians have now captured more of the adjoining village of Marinka, which is apparently south of Pesky. And one gets the sense that this whole defense system is cracking. And we also hear about further Russian advances around Kharkiv. We discussed those yesterday in my video, but there's apparently more Russian pressure further south from Udi. The Russians captured Udi about 2 days ago, and this is a city in a town northwest of Kharkiv, and they seem to be pushing downwards, southwards, as they gradually work towards what looks like an encirclement of Kharkiv. And elsewhere on the Donbass front, the Russians have also been continuing to make inroads into Bakhmut and Soledar, and they've been piling up the pressure on Siversk. In other words, the Russians are applying pressure on the Ukrainians at every point in this 1,500 kilometer line. Now, that is an extremely long line for Ukraine to defend. And this is despite the fact that apparently the Ukrainians still outnumber the Russians in infantry, but the Russians clearly have the initiative, apparently because their artillery and aircraft and drones and all of these things are so much more effective. So it's the Russians who are choosing when and where to attack. And we see that even with their large numbers of infantry, which, by the way, suffer continuous and very heavy losses, Ukraine is having to shuttle its people up and down the front lines, trying to plug gaps and holes as they're being created. Now, yesterday, there was a brief report, which I completely discount, by the way, but it suggested that there was large columns of Ukrainian troops fleeing from Bakhmut towards the Dnieper River, towards Dnipro, the city west of the Dnieper River, which is one of Ukraine's major logistic hubs. By the way, the Russians have made attacks on the railway stations, on the rather the electricity stations that operate the railways from Dnipro, in Dnipro. So the Russians are again making attempts to interfere with Ukrainian communications. Anyway, I don't place much credence on this story of Ukrainian troops fleeing to the Dnieper. It's just one of those stories that you constantly see, floating, emerging fog of war type stories. But I will say this: if they were fleeing to the Dnieper, if they were deciding to withdraw to the Dnieper, it would make some kind of sense to me, because looking at things, the Dnieper is a much easier line to hold. After all, it is a river, and you have to cross that river in order to attack the troops on the other side. And it would straighten the front lines. And I feel that, at least in theory, I speak as a non-military person, it would be a much more defendable and easily defendable front line than this massively overextended 1,500 kilometer front line that the Ukrainians are trying to defend. So if Ukraine were withdrawing behind the Dnieper, it would make some kind of military sense, at least to me. Now, I say that, of course, I understand that there are all these contrary arguments that you doing that would mean giving up 40% of Ukraine's territory, including the part of Ukraine's territory that accounts for the greater part of Ukraine's GDP and all of that. And I do understand why there would be a reluctance to do this. But I have to say, if it's a question of preserving GDP, of protecting Ukraine's economy, then it's perhaps worth saying that the situation in the Ukrainian economy at the moment is looking borderline catastrophic. Now, that's not just I who am saying this. I've said already that inflation is rising, that aid from the West is not as high in financial terms as Ukraine would like or would need, that apparently the Ukrainians are going to get about $5 billion of aid this August, but they've said that they need $5 billion to cover their budget deficit every month, and August is the only month up to now when they've received it, and it seems unlikely that they will be able to receive the same amounts of aid in subsequent months. So August looks like the peak, and it's falling, and it's the only month when Ukraine is getting enough money from the West to plug all the gaps. In fact, I suspect that financial aid is going to fall significantly from this point on. And it seems that the International Monetary Fund, to which Ukraine has also turned, is also at the moment unwilling to provide financial aid, or at least it's unwilling to provide aid at the volumes that Ukraine needs. And of course, a couple of weeks ago, that gained almost no publicity, Ukraine asked its creditors for a restructuring, its foreign creditors for a restructuring, which, by the way, they have agreed in principle to do. But that, of course, amounts to an effective default, which means that foreign borrowing at the moment on the financial markets is simply not open to Ukraine. So Ukraine's external financial position is very bad. Its tax revenues have collapsed. Its spending has risen as it is trying to pay for the war, and it's not getting all the financial aid it needs from the United States. And it's getting round these problems by printing money. Now, there's now been a criticism of this policy from a group of international economists. And I'm going to read what has been written about this by Interfax. Interfax is a Russian news agency, but it goes out of its way to be as politically neutral as possible, and it is extremely reliable, and I've no doubt that this is a fair and accurate and impartial report. This is what the report says. A prolonged crisis in Ukraine is becoming increasingly likely, a prospect that calls for a readjustment of Ukraine's macroeconomic strategy. 9 renowned international and Ukrainian economists believe. Unless altered, this course will result in a major economic crisis, Ukrainian media outlets said, citing recommendations issued by the London-based Centre for Economic Policy Research. This crisis marathon requires prudence and caution in private finances, a durable nominal anchor, a resilient financial system, a careful management of external balances, and flexibility and efficiency in the allocation of scarce resources. Various branches of the government must coordinate their efforts to this end, the Economists said. The authors of the document are Torbjörn Becker from Stockholm School of Economics, Barry Eichengreen, Morris Obstfeld, and Yuri Gorodnichenko from the University of California, Berkeley, and CEPR, University of California, Berkeley. Former European Bank for Reconstruction and Development chief economist Sergei Guriev. Sergei Guriev, by the way, is a Russian economist, a dissident Russian economist, and an opponent of the Putin government. But anyway, just mentioning. Now with Science, Sergei Guriev, now with Science Po. Science Po is France's most important business school, and lots of, well, it's one of the major schools that produce people for the French, that educate the French elite. Simon Johnson from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Timothy Milovanov from the Kiev School of Economics, Kenneth Rogoff from Harvard University, Beatrice Veda Di Mauro from Graduate Institute, Geneva. The economists believe that first, the Ukrainian government must mobilize more resources to improve its fiscal position. The aim should be to increase the collection of tax revenues and for remaining shortfalls to be financed preferably through external aid, but if not, through domestic debt issuance with much less reliance on printing money. Controlling and raising the effectiveness of non-military spending is critical for keeping public finances sustainable. Ukraine's allies should radically increase economic aid and accelerate its disbursement, they said. Second, according to the economists, there is an urgent need for a durable nominal anchor. Heavy reliance on money printing to finance government deficits has been unavoidable in the first months after February 24th, but if the current reliance on money finance is sustained, inflation, already over 20%, could easily drift much higher. It's an understatement, I would have thought. The aim should be relatively low inflation, they said. The government should aim to enhance national savings rather than rely on monetary financing from the central bank. In coordination with fiscal authorities, the central bank should implement a flexible framework to support macroeconomic stability. A managed float of the exchange rate is consistent with this goal. Third, external imbalances should be addressed through a combination of strict capital outflow controls, restrictions on imports, and some flexibility in the exchange rate, as well as a comprehensive standstill on external debt payments, the economists said in their recommendations. Fourth, although governments during a crisis usually take over the allocation of resources, Ukrainian circumstances call for more market-based allocation mechanisms to ensure cost-effective solutions that do not overburden the state capacity, exacerbate existing problems such as corruption, or encourage untaxed black market activities, they said. To this end, the aim should be to pursue extensive, radical deregulation of economic activity, avoid price controls, and facilitate a productive reallocation of resources, they said. The government will have to make some difficult choices, the economists said. The last, of course, is a massive understatement. Now, I have to say, looking at all of this, it looks to me like absolutely fantastic suggestions. How does the Ukrainian government, facing a war on its territory, with its industrial base bombed, with large areas of the country, or what was the country, occupied by Russia, with tax revenue having collapsed, how does it control and raise the effectiveness of non-military spending, which is supposedly critical for keeping the finances sustainable? How does it increase debt issuance within Ukraine in place of money printing? I mean, it's defaulting on its foreign obligations. How does it persuade Ukrainians to lend it money? Which Ukrainians are going to lend it money? Ordinary people through war bonds? The oligarchs? The Ukrainian oligarchs who are probably busy taking their money out? Then the economists talk about the urgent need for a durable nominal anchor. How do you create that? What is a durable nominal anchor at this time? And they call for enhancing national savings. Presumably that means increasing interest rates. But how far would raising interest rates have to go? And they talk about a managed float of the exchange rate is consistent with this goal. So what exactly are they saying? Are they saying that the exchange rate should be left to float, in which case the value of the hryvnia, the currency, will collapse? But they talk about a managed exchange rate, which would suggest that the central bank is somehow intended to support the hryvnia through foreign currency interventions in the financial markets, but with what money? And one can easily see how this can all be the target of financial speculators. And of course, inevitably from this group, they call for market-based solutions instead of attempts to take control of the economy, managing what would be effectively a command or control and controlled economy. Well, as I said, these recommendations, I suspect, are unworkable. They may look perfect on a page, but I can't myself see how the Ukrainian authorities can implement them. To a certain extent, they've been able to borrow, or at least they've been able to receive money from the West. And the only part of these recommendations that make any sense in terms of Ukraine's needs, not the West's needs, but Ukraine's needs, is that financing from the West needs to be increased by multitudes. But realistically, all else seems to me impractical and unachievable. And in fact, the Ukrainian authorities have apparently said that if the choice is between money printing and essentially stopping financing for the war, then they're going to continue money printing because they have no choice. Actually, these recommendations that this gaggle of economists has come up with bear some resemblance to what has been done by the other government involved in this conflict, which is, of course, Russia. They have arguably done all of these things. The Russians have not resorted to money printing. They've covered their costs, either by taxation or by debt issuance, limited amounts of debt issuance on their domestic markets, but they've of course been very careful to avoid the appearance of themselves opting for a default. They've never come forward and said that they are themselves going to renege on their financial obligations. The West has tried to say that Russia has defaulted, but nobody in Russia thinks that it's the government that made that choice because it lacked resources to cover any borrowing that it does. And in fact, I understand that Russian OFZs, the Russian ruble bonds are now being issued again, or will be issued again. So that's what they've done, and they do have flexible macroeconomic policies. They do have a managed float of their currency, and of course they do have strict capital outflow controls and very severe restrictions on imports, and they do also operate a standstill on external debt payments. Not all of those things are things that they've chosen to do. Some of them have been chosen for the Russians by the Western powers, but that's what it all amounts to. So you could almost say that this gaggle of economists, Mr. Rogov and Mr. Guriev and all of the others, are essentially telling Ukraine, copy what the Russians are doing. But of course the Russians can do this because they have a vastly bigger, far more diverse, far more effective and efficient and powerful economy. They're still exporting on a major scale. They have large trade surpluses. They have stable budgets. Ukraine is not in a position to do this. It is unrealistic to think that Ukraine can do this. And what this commentary, what this set of proposals in fact shows, what it highlights, is how disastrous Ukraine's economic position is becoming. And I would add that I understand that the mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko, has now warned people in Kiev to prepare for a very cold winter, because there's no guarantees that heating will continue to be provided, because there's a shortage of energy in Ukraine. And of course, if Ukraine does manage to shut down the Zaporozhye nuclear power station, which I read somewhere accounts for 20% of Ukraine's energy needs, well, those energy shortages will presumably become worse still. By comparison with the very dark situation in Ukraine, we learned that inflation rates in Russia are continuing to fall. And the Russian central bank now says that the annualized rate of inflation in Russia is around 15%. It was around 18% in March, but it's fallen. And in fact, we actually have price falls. We've had price falls in Russia throughout June and July, and probably will continue to have price falls through August. And the Russian central bank has now issued a bulletin which says that inflation slows down in most Russian regions. And in July 2022, annual inflation decelerated in the absolute majority of Russian regions, ranging from 3.3% in Chukotka, that is 3.3% as an annualized figure. So in Chukotka, there's been barely any increase in inflation at all, to 20% in Ingushetia. Ingushetia is in the Caucasus, and it's always had much higher inflation for many complicated reasons than the rest of Russia has. And the article goes on to say that the slowdown became possible owing to expanded supply of a range of products, the ruble strengthening in recent months, and moderate demand. The growth rate of food prices edged down in all food federal districts. The main contributor to the decline in food inflation was lower fruit and vegetable prices. Their reduction was associated with larger quantities and lower prices of imported products, as well as saturation of the market with domestic products. The rise in prices for meat and dairy products slowed down as well, amid the trend towards a further expansion of domestic output. As to non-food goods, the lowest price growth rates were recorded in such categories as cars, construction materials, household appliances, and electronic devices. This resulted from the continuing adjustment of demand and the ruble strengthening in recent months. Prices for sawn timber went down due to increased supply in the domestic market driven by restrictions on exports. Contrastingly, the annual growth of prices for services sped up in all federal districts except the Urals federal districts. In most regions, this trend was caused by the recent rise in the demand for flights and the pass-through of costs to airfares. So, declining inflation in Russia, rising inflation in Ukraine, and of course, if you unpack that piece from those economists, Rogoff and Guriev and the others, it's clear that though they don't use the word hyperinflation, that's what they're worried about. That is now becoming a serious possibility. Of course, it's not just financing for which Ukraine is not getting enough. It's not getting enough weapons either, or it's not getting the numbers of weapons that it expected. And in fact, as I've been explaining, ever since I think it was either April or May, the actual trend in Western military arms deliveries to Ukraine since the peak in April and May has been towards a decline. And the latest $1 billion package, the largest in terms of total numbers, dollar signs, but in actual terms of weapon systems supplied, that confirms that. There were no more guns, no more HIMARS launchers, no more surface-to-air missile launchers, no more helicopters, none of those kind of things. And a very senior Ukrainian military official, somebody who's apparently in charge of Ukraine's logistics network, has apparently given an interview to that effect. He's actually said, confirming a report by a Ukrainian commentator in Ukrainian Forbes, that weapons deliveries from the West are falling, and he says, this person says, that the assumption that Ukraine is going to get the weapons it needs from the West is illusory, and it's dwindling away. The United States produces weapon systems for its armed forces. It doesn't have enough to spare for a country like Ukraine, which is using weapons at the rate that Ukraine is using in this conflict. And this military official also said that the Russian military-industrial complex, by contrast, is working 24/7 and is able to pour out all the weapons, all the systems that the Russian military needs, which is why the Russians are able to maintain and sustain this offensive. I previously discussed how this German journalist publishing things for Bild Zeitung, Julian, I can't remember his surname, said that the story that the Russians are running out of steam in Ukraine simply bears no relation to the truth, and anybody who is there, who is actually reporting from the battlefields, can see that for themselves. And that is true. So where are we? Well, I've already said that it would make more military sense to my mind for Ukraine to withdraw its forces west of the Dnieper. As I said, I understand the contrary arguments, but it does seem to me, if you're really looking for a sustainable defense line with the limited forces that you have, a retreat behind the Dnieper would make some kind of sense. It might, I'm not suggesting that this is a defense line that could be indefinitely held, but you might buy yourself some time that way. So you could do that. You could accept that if you continue the way you are, then your economy at some point in the next few months could very well implode into hyperinflation. And you could also take note of the fact that your military supplies from the West are dwindling and have never proved enough. If you withdrew behind the Dnieper, yes, You would lose, perhaps forever, some of your richest territories, larger part of your country, but you might have a chance to preserve the rest and to negotiate a resolution of the war that would enable you to keep it and to stave off the economic crisis that you are now so evidently facing. Doesn't that make a great deal more sense than keeping all those soldiers fighting in Donbass, in all these sort of places, in Kharkiv region, where they're subjected to artillery and rocket and missile strikes and air strikes by the Russians and are dying in their hundreds? Mercouris, that US Marine officer who wrote that exceptional analysis of the war for the Marine Corps Journal. By the way, there's lots of speculation on the internet as to his identity. I'm not going to join it. If Mercouris wants to remain anonymous, I think we should respect it. But anyway, Mercouris has said that some of the artillery barrages that the Russians have rained down on the Ukrainians are comparable in scale to what happened in the First and Second World Wars. So, do you really want to continue to expose your people to that sort of thing? Do you really want to risk the economic collapse of your country? Are you really going to continue to rely on aid from the West, which even some of your key logistics people are telling you is not enough and will never be enough? Are you going to continue with this fiction that you're going to recapture not just Kherson region, but Donbass and Crimea, and that this is the only possible end to the war? Or are you going to face reality? Are you going to pull back behind the Dnieper and sit down and talk? Now, I'm sorry to say, I think that Ukrainian leaders are going to not do that. I think they're going to continue with the war. And I think they're going to continue with these, Hollywood thriller type actions in Crimea, all very exciting. They remind me very much of the sort of things that the British used to get up to in the North African and Italian campaigns. There have been endless numbers of British films about these things, these pinprick attacks that the British launched on the Germans during the Second World War. None of them made any material difference to the outcome of the war, but some of those films, must be said, are rather good. But is that what you're going to do? Are you going to run a war, continue a war, claiming that a bomb attack on a depot here and a attack on a headquarters there and a fire which causes serious damage at an airfield, but that these are real victories, even as your people are dying in their hundreds and your economy is collapsing? Is that how you think war, this most terrible and serious of things, is conducted? Perhaps you do. After all, as many people have pointed out, not just President Zelensky, but many of the people around him are actors or people who have their origins in the world of cinema and entertainment. But all I would say is that if that is the case, then it is a terrible tragedy for themselves, perhaps, but certainly for their country, because it is war fought according to a script, as opposed to war which is being lost in the most terrible way in actual battle and in the economic fields where it really matters. Well, that's me for the day. Obviously there'll be more about all of these events soon. And in the meantime, remember that you can join us and follow what we do on Locals and Telegram and ODYSEE, and of course Rumble and our other platforms. Links under this video, and you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. And please also remember to check out our shop and buy yourself the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, hoodies, sweatshirts, t-shirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Well, there'll be more from me soon to discuss whatever are the latest developments in this crisis. And until then, have a very good day.